Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take a monumental stack of sources. In this case, a raging, multifaceted internet debate sparked by a tennis legend, and deliver you the crystallized, impartial insight.
Hello?
Today, we are strapping on our virtual tennis shoes and stepping onto the clay, the grass, and the hard courts, because we are diving headfirst into the hottest and arguably the most controversial conversation in men's tennis right now.
The era debate.
The era debate.
It is a genuinely high-stakes discussion, isn't it?
Yeah.
Our mission today is to unpack a viral, high-level critique coming directly from Toni Nadal. As most dedicated tennis fans know, that's Rafael Nadal's legendary former coach and uncle. He has publicly questioned the environment surrounding the current generation of superstars. And his comments, well, they've truly forced the entire tennis world to pause and evaluate things.
Absolutely. This goes far beyond mere sports chatter. It's a profound critique aimed squarely at commitment, professional priorities, and, I suppose, the structural depth of generational strength.
It is.
We have diligently gathered the original claim, coupled with a multitude of analytical perspectives, everything from fan analysis and historical comparisons to, technical breakdowns and professional journalist reactions. We need to dissect them all.
Because the opinions are fiercely divided and nobody is holding back.
Not at all.
So the core question we are presenting to you, the learner, is simple but profound, and it sits right at the heart of the sport's future.
Which is?
Is the meteoric success of Carlos Alcaraz and his chief rival Jannik, the duo now affectionately known by the portmanteau Sincaraz, actually benefiting from facing a field that Toni Nadal alleges is both weaker and less committed than the one his nephew, Rafael Nadal, faced?
It's a huge question, and we must establish a clear premise immediately. This deep dive is in no way intended to diminish the frankly breathtaking and incredible achievements of Alcaraz or Sinner.
Of course not.
Alcaraz is, by every metric, a phenomenon. However, as advanced learners, it is essential for us to understand the context of dominance.
Because that context is what ultimately shapes legacy and historical perspective.
Exactly. Right then, let's start at the source and look at precisely what Toni actually said. Okay, let's unpack this. Because Toni starts with incredibly high praise, which is often conveniently buried beneath the ensuing controversy.
It always is, isn't it?
He acknowledges Alcaraz's incredible athletic attributes and affirms, without reservation, that the Spaniard has everything he needs to succeed.
Which is hardly a condemnation. It's a glowing endorsement of Alcaraz's unique ability.
Exactly. But then comes the big statement, the central point that has sparked this massive global argument, the knot, as the source describes it.
Indeed. He pivots swiftly, suggesting that Alcaraz has an advantage that the players a few years ago did not have.
An advantage.
And this advantage, according to Toni, manifests through two core elements that we absolutely must examine separately as they speak to, well, different dimensions of professional sport.
Okay, so what's the first one?
The first element is the assertion that the rivals Alcaraz and Sinner face today are a little weaker.
A little weaker.
Precisely.
Right.
That's the structural strength assessment. But the second, and I think far more inflammatory element, is the claim that these rivals are less committed than those of a few years ago.
And that's the bit that really got people going.
That's the one.
Yeah.
He then attempts to draw a distinction, singling out Jannik Sinner as a great rival who is always present and whose commitment is unquestionable. But he then laments that the others have fallen, by the way. It is a very specific, almost melancholic observation regarding the current depth of the field outside the top two.
And what's crucial is that he doesn't just rely on vague historical memories, does he?
Not at all.
Toni is extremely keen to highlight the specific quality and quantity of rivals that Rafa, alongside Roger Federer and Novak Djokovic, had to consistently contend with.
Yes, he names them.
He names those persistent, career-defining threats: Andy Murray, Juan Martín del Potro, David Ferrer, and Stan Wawrinka.
And what's truly fascinating here is the implication embedded within his definition of a strong era. Toni Nadal isn't defining it purely by the astronomical standards set by the big three or four themselves. He defines it by the consistently high level of the next tier of players.
The guys just below them.
Yes. He stresses repeatedly that those players, Murray, Del Potro, Ferrer, Wawrinka, were not just intermittent threats, they were always there.
So he's talking about omnipresence, isn't he? They weren't just flash-in-the-pan Grand Slam threats. They were players who ensured that reaching a quarterfinal, or perhaps even more importantly, a semifinal in any major tournament.
Be it a slam or a Masters 1000 event.
Was never a guaranteed walkover, regardless of your ranking. You were forced to play your best tennis from the round of 16 onwards every single time.
Exactly. That immediate implication is damning. He suggests that today's second tier isn't just missing the Grand Slam titles, but is missing that crucial career-long consistency.
That always there factor.
That omnipresent, week-in, week-out threat level. This really sets the philosophical framework for the rest of our deep dive. Were those historical figures truly always there? And if not, what factors, be they commitment or ability, had shifted today?
Right. Let's focus now on the less committed label, the element that generates the most heat. This immediately drew comparison in our source material to the most typical of critiques, the standard kids these days complaint you hear in every sport.
Of course. Where older generations reflexively devalue the new era relative to their golden era interpretation.
The classic recency bias.
That is a very fair initial reaction and one we must interrogate. But the discussion gets quickly nuanced when you look at the evidence presented.
Okay.
We have numerous arguments supporting the idea that something fundamental has shifted in the required level of professional dedication necessary to reach the absolute apex of the sport.
So it's not just an old man yelling at a cloud.
Not entirely.
Yeah.
The sources explore several specific modern factors that contribute to this perceived shift.
Starting with the obvious, I suppose. Modern life and the sheer volume of external distractions, which simply didn't exist in the same way 20 years ago.
Precisely. Modern players are rarely just tennis players anymore, are they?
No.
They're influencers, content creators, businessmen, managing personal brands, social media schedules, and endorsement obligations that are far more complex than a few decades ago.
Which inevitably leads to a perceived reduction in the time spent solely focused on court.
Or, perhaps more importantly, a mental energy drain away from the constant brutal grind of training and recovery. One source pointed out that Toni Nadal, who famously demanded from Rafa that quitting was not an option and that tennis required 100% of your life, represents a coaching philosophy that might simply be considered, archaic or unsustainable in the current professional ecosystem.
And the sources mention a genuine real-world shift in personal priorities, too, which speaks to a larger societal change among young, wealthy professionals.
It suggests a fundamental change in the acceptable definition of work-life balance for modern athletes. Sources note that modern male players tend to prioritize getting married and having children sooner in their careers than the previous generation.
Right.
They are perhaps less willing to sacrifice starting a family or miss a birthday, wedding, Christmas for the sake of hyper-focused, uninterrupted tennis preparation, compared to the previous generation, where that kind of all-consuming personal sacrifice was the unquestioned norm for the big three.
Wait, I have to challenge that point slightly. Is that lack of commitment, or is it simply a healthier perspective on life?
That's a great question.
It's easy for us to praise the big three's ruthless focus, but they also spoke about the intense mental pressure and inability to switch off. If a player is happier and better balanced, couldn't that increase their longevity, even if they sacrifice a tiny bit of intensity?
That's a highly valuable distinction, and one the sources debate fiercely. The pro-Tony side would argue that while a healthier balance is admirable, you don't achieve GOAT status by being balanced. You achieve it through monomaniacal temporary sacrifice.
I see the point.
And the discussion points to specific player examples, which make it harder to dismiss this as mere boomer nostalgia.
Right, let's bring in the specific anecdotes.
We see direct mention of Alexander Zverev's past issues. His former coach, Juan Carlos Ferrer, who is now, perhaps ironically, Alcaraz's coach, actually ceased coaching Zverev, partly because of Zverev's lack of professionalism on his diet and his rest.
Right, I remember that.
This suggests that even for a player who has reached world number 3, the rigorous, ascetic demands of absolute professionalism sometimes take a backseat.
And there were others mentioned.
There's also mention of players like Musetti struggling with motivation after early success, or Rune having issues with putting in the consistent day-to-day effort required to maintain a top ranking.
And the Gael Monfils example really crystallizes the financial shift that underpins this whole commitment argument.
It does. Monfils is famously entertaining and immensely talented, but perhaps not historically as ruthlessly dedicated as the big three.
That's fair to say.
Yet the source cites that he made $24 million on the court having fun with some effort. This shows that today, a player can have immense financial success and a highly lucrative career without committing to the absolute grind and the personal sacrifices that the big three had to endure to win slams.
So the crux of the commitment argument seems to be this. When the financial rewards are so high, even for the second or third tier of players, the motivation to pursue that final, often painful 5% of all-consuming effort
The effort that separates top five from GOAT contention.
might simply diminish. The reward-to-effort ratio shifts dramatically.
Precisely. If you can make £50 million being world number 7 and enjoying your off-season, why suffer the psychological and physical torment required to be world number 1?
A very good question. Now, let's introduce the essential counterargument, because many sources argue that commitment is not the problem. It's simply a difference in innate ability or peak level against two generational anomalies.
And they cite powerful counterexamples of players who are demonstrably ultra-committed. Alex de Minaur and Taylor Fritz, for example, are described as playing literally every tournament offered to mankind.
They're definitely putting the hours in.
They're clearly working hard. Their ceiling just might be lower against the unique brilliance of Sinner and Alcaraz, rather than a lack of desire.
There was also a strong point made about the translation nuance. When Toni Nadal says less committed, could that simply be a mistranslation or a cultural phrasing meaning less consistently dangerous?
That possibility was quickly put to bed by one of our Spanish-speaking sources.
Oh, really?
They confirmed the Spanish phrase Toni used, menos comprometidos que los días algunos años, refers directly to professional commitment or dedication, not consistency of results.
So he meant what he said.
He really does mean that the players are less professionally devoted to the highest standard of the sport, as he knew it.
So if we synthesize this entire commitment section, the term itself has changed. It might not mean effort, because everyone in the top 100 works incredibly hard.
Of course.
But it means that all-consuming, tunnel-vision professional focus, the kind that defined the careers of Federer, Nadal, and Djokovic, who often admitted they were never truly able to relax due to their careers, that level of professional ruthlessness might just be less prevalent and perhaps less necessary financially in the modern game.
And that in itself represents a fascinating sociological and economic transformation within the sport of tennis.
Right then, we transition now to the weaker rival claim, which requires a deep forensic examination comparing the mid-tier players of both eras.
This is where it gets really interesting.
It is, because the source material immediately starts pulling apart the exact players Toni Nadal named, questioning the glossy veneer of nostalgia.
It is an absolutely necessary breakdown, because nostalgia has a tendency to smooth out the edges of historical reality. We need to look critically at the three biggest non-Big Four names Toni cited: Juan Martín del Potro, Stan Wawrinka, and David Ferrer.
Let's start with Del Potro, who is revered by fans for his immense power, but the source material is quick to point out the huge, unavoidable caveat:
The injuries.
Chronic, career-defining injuries.
Del Potro is rightly described as a different beast and a real contender when healthy. He possessed a forehand that was arguably the most destructive weapon in the game.
No question.
But the core issue is that the big three rarely, if ever, competed against a healthy year-in, year-out version of Del Potro for a sustained period.
He was just so unlucky.
Frequently sidelined, sometimes for years at a time, limiting his overall consistency as a rival across multiple seasons, which is the very metric Toni Nadal values.
Yet, we cannot ignore his peak. He is, after all, one of the few players who beat a peak Federer to win a slam at the 2009 U.S. Open. That victory alone speaks volumes about his ceiling.
Absolutely. His ceiling was arguably higher than anyone outside the big three. But if we are measuring the strength of an era based on consistent, reliable threats, as Toni suggests, then a player who spends half his career in rehabilitation, however brilliant, cannot be counted as an always-there rival.
A fair point. Next, we have Stan Wawrinka, the ultimate dark horse, or as one source brilliantly calls him, one of the biggest outliers in tennis history.
A great description.
His 3 slams are undeniable proof of quality.
Wawrinka's success was incredible, but our sources show it was heavily concentrated, reinforcing the point about inconsistency.
Okay.
They highlight his phenomenal run of winning 3 Grand Slams in a 4-year stretch, which is an achievement that rivals many Hall of Famers' career totals. However,
There's a however.
There is. They balance this by pointing out his stark inconsistency outside of those majors.
How stark are we talking? Give us the details the sources provided.
We're talking extreme concentration. In that prolific period, Wawrinka won only 1 Masters 1000 title.
Only one.
Just one. He made only 5 Tour Finals appearances across his peak years. And crucially, sources note he was often losing early in Masters events, frequently in the second or third rounds, to players far outside the top 10.
So he wasn't a consistent week-in, week-out threat.
Not at all. It suggests he was not consistently elite across a full calendar year, even during his peak. He had this remarkable ability to switch on for 2 weeks, become Stan the man, and achieve, Thanos-level power.
Right.
But he lacked the Nadal-esque machine consistency. He was top 12 for 10 years before he suddenly popped off.
That statistic, only 1 Masters title despite 3 slams, is hugely revealing. It suggests that while his peak could pierce the big 3, his day-to-day threat level across the tour calendar was significantly lower than, say, a Medvedev today.
Exactly. And finally, David Ferrer, the ultimate grinder, a machine of consistency.
But was he a genuine threat to lift the biggest trophies?
Well, Ferrer was a marvel of consistency, truly a mainstay in the top 10 for 7 or so years, constantly reaching deep into tournaments, which certainly supports Toni's argument about consistency.
He made a slam final.
He did. Multiple Masters finals and 1 Grand Slam final. But the counter-argument from the sources is brutal. Some dismiss him as a lightweight compared to the Big Four, who was often Nadal's punching bag on clay.
And the most damning metric the sources provided must be that head-to-head record against Federer.
It is utterly damning. Ferrer's 0-17 record against Federer suggests that against 2 of the Big Three, he simply never possessed the final weapon.
The big shot.
Whether that was a destructive serve or a big forehand, he lacked what was needed to truly lift the biggest trophies consistently. He was a perfect example of consistency without that ultimate ceiling.
That paints a complex picture. High-quality rivals, yes, but often either injury-prone like Del Potro, inconsistent across the calendar like Wawrinka, or lacking the final weapon needed to beat the very best like Ferrer.
They were threats, but perhaps not the unrelenting multi-year threats nostalgia makes them out to be.
Right. Now let's compare this historical context to the current best of the rest. Daniel Medvedev, Alexander Zverev, Stefanos Tsitsipas, Taylor Fritz, and the emerging talents.
Ben Shelton, Jack Draper, and so on.
The sources here present a compelling, if harsh, argument for the current era being weaker, and the central, inescapable piece of evidence is
Novak Djokovic.
the continued presence of Novak Djokovic.
Yes, the fact that the current second-tier struggles so profoundly against a 38-year-old Djokovic is frequently cited as the strongest proof of weakness.
It's a hard point to argue with.
It is. Sources argue quite vehemently that this version of Djokovic is extremely low compared to his peak self, that his core strengths, particularly his explosive movement, his ability to defend impossible shots, and his elite return positioning, are anything special anymore. He's become, according to one analyst, a generic serve plus FH player, reliant on point construction and mentality rather than sheer physical dominance.
And yet the current field still can't consistently beat him in slams.
Exactly.
If the next generation can't outperform a version of the greatest player who is arguably playing at maybe 85% of his previous standard, does that not validate Toni's entire point?
It absolutely strengthens it. The failure of Medvedev, Zverev, and Tsitsipas to dismantle this aging version of Djokovic is seen as proof that they lack the ruthlessness or the technical variety to seize the moment.
And it's not just Djokovic, is it? It's how they perform against Alcaraz and Sinner.
Yes, the sheer dominance of Alcaraz and Sinner over the rest of the top 30 also supports this weakness narrative in current match play.
We've seen match summaries where Sinner or Alcaraz simply dismantle top 10 opponents from the second week onwards at a slam. What specific evidence do the sources cite?
Sources note that outside of the top 2, the top 10, 20, and 30 is perceived as pathetic because players often fold quickly after a tough first set.
Right.
The empirical evidence cited is Sinner's performances in slams. His matches from the round of 16 onwards often end with scorelines like 6-1, 6-2, 6-2 against established top 10 players.
Why?
This suggests a systemic lack of ability to sustain pressure or to truly fight for a single match against the hyper-elite. In the Big Three era, you might get beaten by the Big Three, but the scorelines were usually much tighter against the likes of Ferrer or Murray.
Okay, let's tackle the direct comparison tally. Is Zverev better than Del Potro or Ferrer? This debate boils down to a straight clash between 2 different metrics of greatness.
It is highly contentious, and this is where the deeper analysis is needed. Some argue Zverev is objectively ahead of Del Potro and Ferrer because Zverev has accumulated 7 Masters titles and 2 ATP Finals wins.
That's a lot.
It demonstrates immense consistency throughout the season, which is crucial for a top-5 player. They attribute Del Potro's lower tally one slam, one Masters almost entirely to injury, thus suggesting Zverev is the more valuable, consistent rival Toni Nadal is looking for.
But the counter-argument is that quantity of Masters titles doesn't equal quality of peak, does it?
Exactly. Conversely, others argue that Del Potro, when healthy, was a real contender, whose ceiling was simply higher evidence by that slam win over Pete Federer.
Mm-hmm.
They also point to Zverev's notorious tendency to choke at every opportunity in the late stages of slams, compared to Del Potro's fighting spirit against the prime Big Three.
So the debate is whether you value Zverev's consistent results across the calendar or Del Potro's potential to win the biggest prize.
Exactly. It's an impossible subjective comparison, which is precisely why Toni's debate endures.
So after wading through all that data, what does this all mean? The most sophisticated counter-argument against Toni Nadal's critique is that he, and many nostalgic fans, are suffering from profound recency bias and a golden era interpretation.
Yes.
They are comparing the present day, a tiny 2-year snapshot, to a vast 20-year history of accumulated greatness.
This is a crucial dimension that demands more time. We are suffering from the sample size problem. The Sincaraz era of dominance is arguably only 2 years old.
Just 2 years.
Yet we are comparing it to the big 3-4 era, which spanned over 2 decades. To use an analogy, it's like comparing the first season of a brilliant new TV show to the entire 10-season catalog of a beloved classic.
You're cherry-picking.
You are cherry-picking the absolute peak moments from a 20-year history and using that to judge 2 players who have barely reached their mid-20s.
And if you genuinely look back at the early timeline of the Federer-Nadal era, it looked very different to the historical narrative we tell today.
Very different.
We forget how weak the field was perceived to be before the full constellation of rivals aligned.
Sources draw compelling early-era parallels. If you went back to, say, 2005, just 2 years into the Federer-Nadal ascendancy, many of those great rivals, Toni, named Djokovic, Murray, Wawrinka, were either not yet established or hadn't had their breakthrough moments.
Right.
At that point, the prevailing narrative was that Federer would dominate forever. The field was absolutely perceived as weak then, too, before the rivals matured into their defining roles.
Mm-hmm.
Fans suffered from Federer fatigue because he faced so little sustained opposition.
So let's get specific about Rafael Nadal's early years, since he is the direct point of comparison here.
Right. When Rafa was Alcaraz's current age, which was 22 in 2008, Djokovic and Murray were just starting to consistently challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Djokovic won a slam and Murray reached a final that year, signaling a shift. But before that, there were years when, as one source noted, only Roger could consistently challenge Nadal at the slams, especially on clay.
It wasn't an instant four-way battle.
No, the true, relentless, and multifaceted challenge from Murray, Wawrinka, and Del Potro was not immediately present when Nadal was 22. It took significant time to fully establish itself over the next 5 years.
So while some sources rightly point out that Nadal objectively faced way harder competition than Alcaraz up until their current ages, due to Djokovic and Murray's faster rise.
Compared to the current field, yes.
That competition still took time to mature into the sustained force Toni Nadal remembers. It wasn't an instantaneous golden era from 2005.
And that underlines the underlying message. Patience. The current era is young, and what looks like structural weakness now could simply be the prelude to strength. We are making massive historical judgments based on a very limited time frame.
So the potential for rise is still very much there, lurking just outside the top 10.
Absolutely. There's immense potential for other players to pop off. Sources speculate that players currently sitting just below the elite like Jack Draper, Ben Shelton, or Lorenzo Musetti could evolve or make their quality leap in the coming years.
Once they gain experience and improve their conditioning.
Yes. They remind us, quite correctly, that Stan Wawrinka was just a perennial top 12 player for 10 years before he had his astonishing breakthrough, winning his first slam at age 28.
It takes time.
It takes time for the next generation to realize their potential and find the necessary tactical edge. Rushing to call it a weak era after only 2 years of Sincaraz dominance is a failure of historical perspective.
Right. Let's look beyond just individual players and their commitment levels.
Yeah.
What has fundamentally changed in the game itself that influences this debate about structural strength? This moves us away from player critique and towards systemic factors that shape how the sport is played.
Well, there's the standard compelling counter-argument that the sport always evolves, meaning athletes are inherently better now, standing on the shoulders of the previous generation.
Right.
One source argues that current players are better, fitter, and more tactically aware, simply due to accumulated knowledge.
That's the classic evolution argument. Every generation benefits from improved knowledge in fitness and nutrition science, leading to more complete games.
Yes.
If this is true, then even the weaker players today should theoretically be tougher than the second tier of 2005.
That is the premise. The brilliance of the Big Three is supposed to become the standard for the next generation to build upon. However, this argument is fundamentally countered by the idea that evolution doesn't necessarily dictate strength across the board. It dictates fitness to adapt to a specific environment.
And that environment is perhaps the biggest systemic culprit for the feeling of weak depth.
Court convergence.
Court convergence is a major technical point that often gets overlooked in fan debates. Let's drill down on the specific changes the sources highlight.
This is a major factor driving homogeneity. The source material points directly to the intentional slowing down of court conditions across major tournaments, combined with the standardization of surfaces.
And the technology.
And crucially, the modern advancement in string technology, specifically the rise of heavy-duty polyester strings, has radically changed how the game is played.
How does string technology contribute to the weakness or lack of variety?
Well, polyester strings allow players to generate far more topspin and pace without sacrificing control. This has fundamentally reduced the efficacy of classic serve and volley play and approach shots, and made aggressive baseline hitting the default, universally successful strategy.
It all becomes a bit samey.
This convergence means that if every surface plays similarly, and the primary successful tactic is optimized baseline aggression, it dramatically reduces the number of players who can challenge an elite talent like Alcaraz or Sinner on all courts.
Because it just rewards the guys who can do that one thing the best.
It rewards those who can consistently hit the heaviest ball with the highest margin for error.
So the environmental convergence unintentionally filters out the specialists, the older style serve and volleyers or the pure clay court magicians who might have previously provided stylistic variety and unique challenges.
Precisely. If the tour is homogeneous, the few players who master that homogeneous style will dominate ruthlessly, creating the appearance of weakness below them, even if the overall fitness and quality of the top 100 is higher than ever.
Which brings us to the distinction between the rest of the field and the top 10. The top 10 seems weaker, but what about the rest of the field, the top 100 or 200?
It is widely suggested in the sources that the top 100-200 is actually much deeper and better than it was 20 years ago. Athletes across the board are hitting harder, moving faster, and are far more physically complete. But this only accentuates the issue. If the top 100 is stronger, but the top 10 lacks depth, it suggests the gap between Alcaraz Center and the rest of the tour is simply colossal.
Right. Perhaps even wider than the gap Federer established in 2005.
Which returns us to the Alcaraz-specific context. Perhaps his dominance isn't purely due to weaker opponents, but because his unique hybrid game is simply the perfect answer to this converged homogeneous environment.
That's a great point.
The high praise he receives certainly supports this theory. Andre Agassi is cited giving Alcaraz truly breathtaking praise, calling him a combination of all the Big Three's best attributes.
What were they?
He can defend like Novak, he has the soft hands and feel like Federer, and he can generate RPMs and pace like Rafa.
Why me?
If Alcaraz possesses this uniquely complete hybrid game, then any perceived weakness in the field simply highlights his status as an anomaly, a player so far ahead of the curve that he makes even high-quality players look second-rate.
So it's not that they're weak, it's that he's different.
He is the evolution.
He's a tactical synthesis of the golden era. That's a fascinating way to frame it.
Analyzing the potential long-term impact of Toni Nadal's statement on Carlos Alcaraz's eventual legacy is critical. Legacy is often defined not just by how many times you win, but by the undeniable quality of the rivals you consistently beat.
This creates a unique potential problem for both Alcaraz and Sinner then. If this trend of dominance continues without the emergence of a consistent third, fourth, or fifth major challenger,
A player who can force a fifth set week after week.
they might face the unfortunate stigma for breaking records in an alleged weak era. It would be entirely unfair, but it would diminish their achievements in the public eye, even if they are empirically several levels above these guys.
It is an incredibly unfair standard to place on a young champion, especially since players cannot choose their era. The critique is about the environment, not their talent.
Of course.
And it's why Alcaraz's own view on the matter is so refreshing and mature. He demonstrates real humility.
What did he say?
He's quoted as stating that he has Far from being the best player in tennis or overall, because there are still many players who can beat me and I've lost to many players.
That's very grounded.
This self-awareness contrasts sharply with the sweeping weak-era accusations, proving he isn't taking his current dominance for granted.
But the sheer speed of his success, even in this alleged weak environment, provides its own context, doesn't it? It suggests he's operating on a timeline few others have ever matched.
Indeed, our sources highlight rapid achievements that directly mirror Nadal's early career. Alcaraz recently secured his 5th Grand Slam title at the exact same age as Rafael Nadal.
That is a staggering pace of accumulation.
It is. Furthermore, he has already matched Nadal's entire career total of grass court titles, which stands at 4. This shows his immediate versatility across surfaces, something Nadal took longer to achieve.
And the hidden statistic that proves his mental strength, regardless of the opponent, is his record in deciding sets.
Absolutely. His success rate in 5-set matches is currently the highest of all time, sitting around 92.9%.
Wow.
These aren't just records. They are concrete data points showing that Alcaraz is operating at an anomalous historical level of mental fortitude and physical endurance, regardless of the overall field's depth. He simply finds a way to win when the stakes are highest.
Which is the ultimate hallmark of a champion.
It is.
So, concluding this entire discussion on a balanced note, this deep dive shows that the debate isn't easily settled with objective metrics or statistics. It's a messy, passionate clash of nostalgia, historical comparison, and the aggrieving reality of the sport under new technological and economic pressures.
The ultimate takeaway is that Toni Nadal's critique is provocative, but rooted in the idea of consistent non-big three threats. The current dominance of Sincaraz in this 2-year snapshot is so overwhelming that it inevitably obscures the potential of their peers.
Just as the early dominance of Federer obscured the future rivals like Djokovic and Murray.
Exactly, who would eventually emerge. We simply must wait and see who among Draper, Shelton, or the others steps up to define this generation's rivalry.
So we've taken you through the sources and the core arguments in intricate detail. Toni Nadal's critique boils down to 2 complex things. First, that rivals lack the consistent week-in, week-out threat level of the mid-2000s field. And second, that commitment in professional tennis has fundamentally changed, moving away from the big three's all-consuming monastic professional focus toward a more balanced, distracted, but still immensely lucrative model.
We've armed you with the various perspectives, from the statistical data points showing the concentration of Wawrinka's success and the injury struggles of Del Potro, to the sophisticated observation that Alcaraz is simply a uniquely gifted hybrid player, perfectly suited to the modern converged court environment.
Right.
You now have the full context, the statistics, the anecdotes, and the sociological critique to form your own well-informed opinion on whether this truly is a weaker era or simply an early one defined by 2 generational talents.
And we leave you with this final provocative thought to mull over until our next deep dive. If the top 100 is indeed deeper, fitter, and more professional than ever before, as many technical sources claim, does the apparent weakness at the very top, the colossal gap between Sincaraz and the rest of the field, simply highlight the extreme, anomalous, and perhaps fundamentally unsustainable level of commitment, focus, and unique hybrid skill required to transition from a top 100 professional to a consistent, genuine champion in the modern, hyper-competitive game?
It's a great question.
It may not be that the field is weak, but that the standard required for the very top has become impossible for everyone but 2 or 3 generational talents in any given decade.
Something to ponder next time you watch Alcaraz hit that defensive lob or Sinner unleash that flat forehand. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.